Hello, my name is Angela Hayes. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni and Online Career Engagement, and I'm going to be giving a presentation on imposter syndrome. I chose this topic because I'm hearing about it a lot in the last year or so. Because of the hot job market, many people are getting offered positions or promoted into positions that they don't feel they're qualified to do. It's important to keep in mind that you would not have been hired if those who hired you didn't think you could do it. When I tell people that, they usually say some variation of, yeah, that's true for most people, but I somehow slip through the cracks. I really have no idea what I'm doing. And it's just a matter of time before they figure that out. So I've been hearing things like, I feel like an imposter. I don't deserve my success. I didn't deserve that promotion. I'll bet people know I'm a fraud. It'll be so embarrassing when people find out I'm not who they think I am. Or, maybe it'll just be a relief to have it out in the open. I'd like to ask you to think about something as we begin this discussion. Do you only want to take on tasks and opportunities that you're positive you can do? Or do you want to take some risks that can lead to growth and reaching toward your real potential? What might you be missing out on by not believing you can do it and just stopping there instead of trying? Do you want to know what you're really capable of? So we'll be talking about what imposter syndrome is, why it happens, and what to do about it, because I don't want it to hold you back. Imposter syndrome is the psychological phenomenon in which you feel like you don't deserve your accomplishments. You might feel like you don't belong, you don't deserve your success, or you're out of place. You might be constantly worried that others will expose you as a fraud. People with imposter syndrome are unable to internalize their success. They tend to think that awards and promotions were just luck or being in the right place at the right time, but that they will be found out as a fraud. It can affect anyone from students to professionals to highly accomplished and successful people. In 1978, psychologists first labeled the imposter syndrome phenomenon. They thought that it was most common among high-achieving women. That's who they were studying. Now, 40 years later, it's found to affect about 70% of everyone at some point in their lives. The imposter syndrome cycle usually goes something like this. A new task, a new job, or a promotion opportunity arises, causing feelings of self-doubt or anxiety. Fear of being exposed as a fraud sets in. In response, you say no to an opportunity or accept it, but either over-prepare or procrastinate. And then after the task is complete, you discount any positive feedback and focus intently on what you think you did wrong or could have done better. So, do you have imposter syndrome? Do you ever feel like you don't deserve what you've achieved? Do you ever worry that people will one day find out that you're not worthy? Do you dismiss every success as good luck or timing? Do you think that others have simply been tricked into thinking that you're better than you actually are? Do you agonize over the smallest flaws in your work? Do you downplay your expertise, even in areas where you're genuinely more skilled than others? If you answered yes to 2 or more of these, buckle up because we got some work to do. But also, if any of these things are true for you, you're in good company. Here are a few examples of famous people who have expressed imposter syndrome thoughts. No matter what we've done, there comes a point where you think, how did I get here? When are they going to discover that I'm, in fact, a fraud and take everything away from me? That was Tom Hanks. You think, why would anyone want to see me again in a movie? And I don't know how to act anyway, so why am I doing this? Meryl Streep, most Academy Awards nominated person of all time. Maya Angelou also talked a lot about how with each book she published, she just knew that this was the time that she would be found out as an imposter who had no idea what she was doing. One of the ways she combated these feelings also became her most famous quote. Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. The important thing is not to avoid ever feeling like an imposter. It's to utilize tools, insight, and information to make sure that you have imposter moments, but not an imposter life. The main goal is to keep these kinds of thoughts from turning into the way you consistently think of yourself, your way of being. These are the 5 patterns most commonly seen with imposter syndrome. I've given you a self-test in the worksheet, and you'll find the worksheet below this YouTube video. The worksheet will help you determine which of these patterns fits you best. Knowing your most common patterns can help you disrupt them before they derail you. Perfectionists have extremely high expectations of themselves. If they only meet 99% of their goals, they feel like failures. Any small mistake seems like a really big deal. Experts feel the need to know every single piece of information before they start a project, and they constantly look for new certifications or trainings to improve their skills. They always feel as if they need more learning and skills than what they have at any given moment. They won't apply for a job unless they meet 100% of the criteria listed. They often refrain from asking questions in class or in a meeting because they think they should already know the answer, and they don't want to be found out as the person who doesn't know the answer. If a natural genius has to struggle or work hard to accomplish something, they feel like a failure. They're used to things coming easily. They tend to think that they should always be smart, a fast learner, and excel at everything. If they have to put in effort, they think it must mean that they're not good enough and are therefore an imposter. They somehow miss that people learn and improve with effort and practice, that they're not just born knowing everything. Soloists feel like they have to accomplish tasks completely on their own. If they have to ask for help, it means they're failures. Super people push themselves to work harder than everyone else to prove that they are not imposters. They feel the need to take on more and more responsibility. They tend to need to excel at all aspects of life and often feel stressed if they're not actively accomplishing something in any given moment. You might be some combination of 2 or more of these as well. I know that I am. In fact, I'm a combination of all 5, but to a much, much lesser degree than I used to be. So the causes of imposter syndrome. There's not a single answer. It could be just personality, just someone who internalizes blame when things don't go well. Could be that you grew up with parents who were never satisfied with your achievements, or you were taught that mistakes were really bad and something to be avoided, or taught that perfection was the only worthwhile goal, or praised for everything and told that you were going to do these great things in life. So that kind of put on pressure. Or you were told you weren't smart and shouldn't expect much from your future, but then you're in college or in an important role and you're doing really well, and it just doesn't make sense to you. It feels off, like maybe you didn't deserve the success. Or maybe everything came easily to your siblings, but not to you. You were a late bloomer and now you're doing really well. Maybe you've already surpassed them in achievement, but it's hard to let go of those feelings of not being as capable. Or you might have come from a family who placed a high value on achievement, or one who flipped back and forth between offering praise and being critical, so you didn't form a strong sense of your capabilities. The point here isn't to blame anyone. It's to begin to unravel the possible origins so that you can use that information to move forward. We'll talk more about that when we cover the importance of self-talk. And it doesn't have to be the past. It can also be something happening in the present, like working in a place where very few people look and sound like you. This can be especially true when you belong to a group where there are stereotypes, like racial or ethnic minorities, women in STEM fields, or international students at American universities. Imposter syndrome is more common when people are going through transitions or trying new things. The pressure to achieve, combined with a lack of experience, can trigger feelings of inadequacy. Imposter syndrome has been on the rise since millennials and Gen Z have been in the workforce. The reason it's on the rise is most likely because baby boomers tended to hold a relatively small number of jobs throughout their lives. Millennials and Gen Z are much more likely to job hop, so they often find themselves as the new person who needs to prove themselves. Here are the things we're going to talk about as we help you move away from imposter syndrome and toward just having the common imposter thoughts and moments that we all have. Remember, the important thing is not to avoid ever feeling like an imposter, is to utilize the tools, insight, and information to make sure that you have imposter moments, but not an imposter life. Now, let's dig deeper. When we're feeling like an imposter in any given situation, it often sets off the fight, flight, or freeze effect. So it's important to know how to recognize it and what to do about it. Now, I'm sure you all had this in one class or another, but just as a quick review, imagine back in caveman days, the caveman comes around a boulder and is faced with a saber-toothed tiger. He has basically three main options. He can fight and do it well enough to get away. He can run fast enough to get away, or he can be totally overwhelmed with fright and just freeze. We're not descended from the freeze guys, by the way, they got eaten. So when fight, flight, or freeze sets in, it causes all kinds of physiological changes. Blood flows away from the extremities, so you're less likely to bleed if you're injured or bitten. It flows toward the major organs and the major muscle groups so that you can run fast and have increased strength to either run or to fight. Cortisol and adrenaline course through our brains and bodies. We're primed to react, not think things through and look at all the possible angles. We just act. So the good news is that fight, flight, or freeze is why we're all still on the planet. The bad news is that it can have some negative effects since we are rarely in life or death situations, thankfully, but our bodies react just the same as if we were. We're wired for it, and we react just the same. So when in fight or flight, we get tunnel vision. We often misinterpret what we see and we miss opportunities. When we're in fight or flight, our brains are wired to look for danger and threats, to look for what seems wrong or out of place because our ancestors relied on that for survival. Consequently, lots of things look like threats and feel like something is really wrong when we have that tunnel vision. Confirmation bias comes in here too, because we're likely to see only the things that confirm what we already think. In the case of imposter syndrome, that we don't know what we're doing, and everyone else knows it too. We can see it in their faces, hear it in their voices, whether it's really there or not, and it's probably not. So the goal is to get back to baseline as soon as possible so that you can see things clearly and react appropriately. An easy way to do this is with deep abdominal breathing for about 1 to 2 minutes. So if you put one hand on your chest and one hand on your stomach, when you breathe in, it's the hand on your stomach that should move. The one on your chest shouldn't move at all. That's deep diaphragmatic breathing, and it cuts the fight or flight response very quickly. The flip side of that is when we're just beginning to get nervous, we usually start breathing these little shallow breaths that just go a little way down into our chest. And that by itself can easily set off the fight or flight response because the body and brain are wired to think that if you're breathing like that, there must be danger nearby and it must be bad. So catch yourself before you go down that road. Also, it's helpful to note that it takes 8 full seconds between the time that something happens And all of these things I just mentioned start happening in your body. So let's look at an example. Let's say you smile at your boss at an event from across the room. She ignores you and turns her back and starts whispering to another director who's standing next to her. You handed in a very important report to her earlier in the day, and you've been obsessing about it since. And now you know for sure that it wasn't any good. It was garbage. She knows it. You know it. Everybody probably knows it by now. That can set off a cascade of thoughts that can send you directly into fight or flight. So it takes 8 full seconds from the time that that happens to the time that the chemicals get released in your brain and the blood starts to flow away from your extremities and, very importantly, away from your brain. Once it sets in, the executive functioning in your brain is mostly gone for now. If you think about it, 8 seconds is a long time. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. You have a lot of time to get a grip, do some deep breathing, tell yourself some good things like, she probably just didn't see me. I'll go over and we can spend a few minutes chatting. I won't ask her about the report. This is supposed to be a party. She probably hasn't even had time to read it anyway. If you don't feel like you're up to that yet, and you know someone who's nearby who you feel really comfortable with, go talk to them for a bit while you calm down before you go over to chat with your supervisor. If all else fails and you're finding it hard to get back to baseline, make that nervous energy work for you. There's tons of research that shows that we feel exactly the same symptoms when we're really nervous and when we're really excited about something. Exactly the same. It all depends on context and, most importantly, how we decide to label the feelings. So if you're faced with something you really want or you really want to do, and you're feeling those symptoms, label it excitement and go for it. We all have negative self-talk that goes on in our heads. Imposter syndrome is a great example of that negative self-talk. It can be very helpful to name the self-talk that you hear and figure out when you're hearing that negative voice in your head that's telling you that you can't do it, or that you shouldn't take the risk, or that everyone else is better at this than you are, and whatever. The voice is heavily researched and it goes by a variety of names. The gremlin, the inner critic, the saboteur. One of my friends calls hers the "you can't do it" committee. When I work with clients on this concept, after we talk about what it is, I ask my clients to choose what they want to name it. One of my past clients has a particularly active inner critic, so he's named it Voice of Judgment and pretended it's a radio station playing in his head. He uses the initials KVOJ, all judgment, all the time, 24 hours, commercial free. It's often helpful to know that this voice is part of the subconscious mind. It's been taking in messages from the time you've been able to process. The subconscious is like a computer. It responds based on what's been programmed into it. For example, the average person has heard the word no or been told what they're not capable of doing approximately 148,000 times by the time they reach 18. One of the jobs of the subconscious mind is to take its programming and make external reality conform to the internal reality that's been painted. So it's working day and night to try to make sure that you are the person your programming says that you are. I've given you some activities in your worksheet to name your critic and create more positive programming. By the way, an important point is that the subconscious doesn't know what's real and what isn't. It only knows what's been programmed into it. That's why you can wake up from a nightmare in a cold sweat and your heart's pounding and you're gasping for breath. It's because the dream is happening in your subconscious and has no idea that you aren't really being chased by a monster and your feet are caught in quick drying cement and then it turns into quicksand and so on and so forth. It's very important to remember that it doesn't know what's real and what isn't. So if you've been told something enough times, or you've told yourself something enough times, or even if something was said to you once when you were really, really upset, that encodes itself into the subconscious And then the subconscious proceeds as if it's true. Things like, you'll never be as successful as your brother, you'll never amount to anything, you're terrible with people, you're not leadership material, you're bad at math. Quite likely, whatever it is, it's not true. It just got randomly programmed in based on someone else's limited view of your capabilities, or possibly your own limited view of your capabilities. So advocate for yourself and point it out when you hear something that sounds suspiciously like the voice of the inner critic. So things like, oh, that's just the way I am. I've always been bad with blank. That's the inner critic, and it's probably not true. Another reminder, in your worksheet, I've got more about the inner critic and how you can work to change any negative or self-defeating programming that you might be dealing with. There's another very important aspect of fighting imposter syndrome that most of us rarely, if ever, think about, and it's this. It's usually not the event or adversity itself that causes us to be stressed, upset, or feel like a fraud. It's our interpretation of the event. It's almost always about the stories we tell ourselves about what happened, our own unique interpretation. Beliefs matter because they shape the quality and intensity of your feelings and influence how you behave as a result, what you do in the moment. This is important because strong, confident people are able to regulate their emotions and control their reactions so that they respond in the best way in any given situation. The goal isn't to be in a great mood all the time. The goal is for our emotions and behaviors to be productive, appropriate responses to the facts of the situation, instead of knee-jerk reactions to whatever beliefs happen to be rolling through our heads. An easy way to think of it is this. A stands for adversity, the adversity you experience. Adversities are events that lead to our reactions. They can be big, like losing a job, or small, like missing a minor deadline or being a few minutes late for a meeting. Most of us think of adversity as leading directly to emotional and behavioral consequences, what we feel and do in response to the thing that happened. It's like it goes from A to C, adversity to consequences. When something good happens, we experience positive emotions. When something bad happens, we experience negative emotions. Seems logical, but it's not accurate. It's not the event itself that causes emotions. It's our thoughts and beliefs about what just happened that causes our emotions and subsequent behaviors. It's the story we tell ourselves about what just happened. Let's look at an example. You're in a meeting in which you haven't said anything. In fact, you can't remember the last time you said anything in this particular meeting. It meets once a week. You feel like an imposter in these meetings, and you don't want to say something that will prove that you don't know what you're doing. However, on this particular day, the topic being discussed is something that you know a lot about, and you decide to give your feedback and suggestions. Seems worth the risk because it's something the company's been struggling with for a long time. After you've spoken, there's dead silence in the room. Everyone is staring at you, and they seem stunned. It feels like hours go by, but it's actually been about 2 seconds. Now, depending on what story you're telling yourself, you might do a couple of different things. If you decide that, oh my gosh, I made a big mistake, now everybody knows I'm a fraud, they know, oh, I can't believe I blurted that out like that, and you make some excuse, say you don't feel well, and you start rushing from the room just as your supervisor begins to speak, and she's smiling. Or is she laughing at me? That's more likely. She's probably laughing. So if that's the case, you left the meeting completely because of what you told yourself about why they were sitting there stunned, staring at you. But what if there was something else that you were telling yourself? What if what actually happened is that they're looking at you in stunned silence because you have just solved the biggest problem that this company currently has. And what you've just said is brilliant. And they're stunned not just by the brilliance, but they're stunned because they're realizing they've never heard you speak before. And they're thinking, oh my gosh, this is just absolutely amazing. And so you could tell yourself, they can't wrap their heads around the depths of my brilliance. They're thinking through all the positive outcomes. I'm a rock star. All right, so you'll feel completely differently if that's what you tell yourself, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I made such a huge mistake. I blurted that out. I shouldn't have done it. So it's not the thing that happened. It's what you decide to say about it in your head, your beliefs, your thoughts. It's not the adversity itself. Your thoughts and beliefs about what just happened. Most people will tell me when I talk to them about this, they'll say, well, I can't control what I think. Yes, you can. You can fight back. You can say no to the critic. You can just change the channel inside your head if you don't like what you're hearing. You can do things to distract yourself until you calm down. And exerting this control will make an unbelievable amount of difference in your level of confidence and resilience, and a huge effect on whether you allow yourself to believe that you're really just an imposter. People can have vastly different responses to the same incident. In fact, some wouldn't see it as an incident at all, or might not even notice that it happened. Why not decide to see the situation in a way that's in your favor? I can promise you it won't be any more outlandish than the negative stories you're telling yourself. Because we're wired for that. Noticing what's wrong and focusing on it is part of what kept us alive on the planet. But telling a story that's in your favor is very likely to be much closer to the truth. So it's important to look at that B-C connection. When something happens and you have a reaction or emotional response, stop and think about what beliefs or thoughts came just before that emotional reaction. Then think again about what happened as objectively as possible, like you were recording it with a video camera. And think to yourself, is there any other way to look at this situation? Then figure out the B. What beliefs or thoughts did you have that led to your feelings and actions? There's a learning curve here. It takes practice, but I promise you it's worth the effort. You can look for patterns and start gathering facts about the things that upset you. Is the way you were looking at the situation true? Are you sure that it's completely true? Would someone else see it exactly that same way? Now, of course, there are situations where our thoughts and beliefs don't really matter because the events are so severe that our reactions are driven by the event itself, like the loss of a loved one or other tragedies. In these cases, the emotions and actions are from the tragedy itself, not our interpretation of it. Later on, how quickly we do or don't bounce back, to the extent that we can, will be dependent on the stories we keep telling ourselves about the tragedy. Now let's get more specific about how our thoughts affect how we see ourselves. There are a number of thinking traps that greatly affect our view of ourselves and our abilities. The first one, jumping to conclusions. Let's say that you've been 6 months at a new job. You get along well with your manager and she's been straightforward with you in her praise of what you're doing well, and she's given you good information about areas she'd like you to improve. You get in one morning and there's a one-line email from your manager. Call me as soon as you can. First, let's all admit that we hear a tone when we read an email or a text. And in this case, the tone that we might hear probably is negative. We probably hear a negative tone and think, oh, I'm in trouble. So we can think of jumping to conclusions as an umbrella error because all thinking traps involve making an assumption, and that's what we're doing here. You might start going over everything that you might have done wrong, checking and rechecking work you've recently sent her, or you might feel certain that you did nothing wrong and get angry at your boss for accusing you of something that was clearly someone else's fault. You might begin rehearsing what you're going to say to her, all instead of doing what she asked, which was to call her as soon as you could. If possible, avoid jumping to conclusions and instead treat your conclusions as theories that need to be tested by gathering the facts. You can take the past into account, of course. If the only emails you've ever gotten from your boss asking you to call her have been because you made a mistake, then it might be reasonable to jump to that conclusion, but still pursue the facts. It's a thinking trap when there's no evidence to support the assumption that you're making. If you tend to jump to conclusions, you know that speed is your enemy. So you'll want to slow down and ask yourself what evidence you're basing your conclusions on. Are you certain? Are you absolutely certain that the way you see it is correct? The next one is tunnel vision. As you think about this one, remember that as humans, our brains can only process so much data, so we take shortcuts. We think that we take in everything, but we only take in a very small amount of what's going on around us. We take in even less if we're in fight, flight, or freeze mode. What we notice and attend to can have everything to do with our current state of mind, the way we see ourselves, or the way we just typically see the world. So with that in mind, imagine that you're standing at the front of your company's main conference room giving an important presentation. In this case, you notice 3 of your colleagues make eye contact throughout the presentation. Your director makes a few encouraging comments, but also yawns 3 times. 2 of your colleagues talk quietly to each other throughout the presentation, and 1 colleague looks at her phone the whole time and walks out halfway through. Is the presentation going well? Probably, because you've selectively noticed the things that I mentioned, but you didn't notice the nods of agreement, the sustained eye contact, the way people are leaning forward with interest, and the informed questions they're asking about how you were able to achieve such high productivity. All of us are only able to attend to part of what's happening, and we tend to sample based on our own biases. We're trying to prove that our biases are correct. So if you decide that the presentation is going poorly, or you come in just knowing that it'll go poorly, then there's a tendency to spin out on anything that we perceive as negative and then take that further. If you're prone to tunnel vision, stop and ask yourself what a fair assessment of the entire situation might be. What's the big picture? How important is this one aspect that you're focusing on to this big picture? The next one is mind reading. All of us mind read. We assume we know what the other person is thinking and we react accordingly, which would be fine, except that we're almost never right. Our tunnel vision keeps us from picking up cues that don't agree with what we know to be true about what the other person is thinking. So let's say you've seen an acquaintance, friend, Jane, at a number of networking events over the last several months. The 2 of you hit it off right away and have since met for coffee several times. She's been very complimentary of your work and has said that she's talking to her boss about having you do some consulting for their company. Doing work for their company has always been a dream of yours, and you're feeling pretty nervous about it and really excited. You sent her the materials that she asked for to present to her boss late last week. She was going to present it to him on Monday of this week. It's now Friday, but you haven't heard back from Jane. You've been worried about not hearing back, but you didn't want to seem desperate, so you haven't called her to check in about how the meeting went. You're currently at a networking event. You see her across the room, smile, wave, and start to move toward her. She scowls at you, turns her back, and starts whispering to someone next to her while she's pointing in your general direction. So think about what sorts of things might go through your mind. Things like, oh, how could I have ever thought my work was good enough for their company? I'm hardly doing well enough in my own company. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't, and I can't imagine the stuff I sent. I really should have thought it through. I should have sent something different. I don't think it would have. Okay, so if you're thinking like that, if you do go over and talk to her, because it might make you decide to just not go over and talk to her, but if you do and you're thinking all these negative things, what's likely to show on your face? What's the tone of your voice likely to be as you talk to her? Because you might also have gotten, um, you might be thinking, she said she was going to let me know how the meeting went, and she didn't call me. It's Friday. That's a whole week, and she hasn't called me. And that's just not right. I mean, that's just not a thing to do to people. So you might then present to her, she might be able to see these things that you're feeling. She'll hear it in your voice. She'll see it in the way you're talking. You might say something like, well, hi, to her. And so let's flip that. If you don't let yourself spin out like that, if you think, oh, I'm sure she didn't see me. I see she wasn't wearing her glasses, so she probably didn't see me. Um, and I know that when she doesn't wear her glasses and she doesn't see very well, that upsets her sometimes, and that's probably what that scowl was about. And on, whatever it is that you think. And you might think, well, maybe there just wasn't even a chance for them to go over it yet, or they didn't have enough time, and maybe they need some additional information. I'll go over and see how things are going and see if they need something additional from me, or she'd like me to talk to her boss directly. So if you go that route, it's all good. If you go with the, well, she hates me, she thinks my work is terrible, and then you act like that, then she sees a completely different person than the person she thought she knew, and then she thinks, I don't know if we want to work with her or not. This is an odd shift. So we do all sorts of self-fulfilling prophecies like this, and we don't know what's happening. We don't check. We just assume. These things shape our lives. So instead of jumping to conclusions and mind reading, instead of all that, try using the second half of this slide to talk yourself through these kinds of situations. A more accurate way of seeing this is blank. That's probably not true because blank. A more likely outcome is blank, and I can blank to deal with it. Now the upside. Not everything about imposter syndrome is negative. There are some perks. A professor at MIT used a survey to divide people into two groups, one of which was composed of people who self-identified as having imposter syndrome. Both groups then did a series of tasks. Those from the imposter group were consistently rated as higher performers with better interpersonal skills and more positive social interactions than the non-imposter group. When they did the study with medical students who had these thoughts, they were found to have better eye contact with patients, better bedside manner, and better overall interactions with patients. They didn't assume that they had all the answers. They listened more intently. Dr. Chloe Carmichael, a clinical psychologist in New York and author of the book Nervous Energy, offers some reasons for these results. She says if you're consistently worried that you are not truly qualified, you probably consistently work to get better. The silver lining is that you do end up more qualified, thanks to an obsessive need for self-improvement. In his recent book, Think Again, industrial organizational psychologist Adam Grant summarizes the main benefits associated with imposter thoughts. First one, motivation to work harder than anyone around you. Once committed to a task, doubting your skills and talents will likely motivate you to give 110%. Try to avoid giving 200 or 300%. That's too much. That quickly leads to burnout. The second thing, openness to new ways of doing things. If you're not convinced that the way you work is the only way, you're more important to suggestions from those around you, which could lead to a productive change in strategy. And three, just becoming a better learner. Someone with imposter syndrome thinks, correctly or not, that they lack knowledge. This leaves them more motivated and open to any new learning that comes their way. Adam Grant stresses that the sweet spot is, instead of thinking that you don't have the capabilities to do something, try thinking that you simply haven't acquired those skills yet, but you will. It's also important to change your tactics when it's time to actually perform. When you're performing, you need your confidence to really shine. So research has shown that the best thing to do in these situations is to give yourself pep talks in second person. Like, you've got this. You've done this before and you crushed it. You're going to have so much fun meeting this challenge. Turns out that we're more likely to believe that and be motivated by it if it's a bit removed. So instead of saying, I'm going to do well at this, I think I'll do well, the second person, makes it a bit removed, like a good friend telling you that you'll do a great job. So imposter syndrome can have its upsides, but it needs to be managed well. Don't let it stop you from moving forward. Don't let it paralyze you. Please don't let yourself avoid things because you think you may not succeed. If you don't succeed, it's not a failure. It's success in finding out what doesn't work. You can change and adjust what you need to and try again. It does get easier over time as you gain more skills and confidence. And don't forget to celebrate your successes. When I started doing presentations, which was many, many years ago now, I would get so nervous that I would nearly black out. Sometimes the room would actually go black around me, although I was still conscious, so I'd have to make sure that I memorized my notes because I couldn't see them. But I kept trying because it was something I really wanted to do, felt that I could eventually be good at, and I thought I could be helpful to a lot of people if I could just hang in there. Adam Grant's favorite approach to taking pride in achievements, and it's mine too, is to imagine talking to your younger self. Compare your current success to your past expectations. If 10 years or 20 years ago you would have known what you would have accomplished by now, how proud would that younger version of you be? Make them even prouder. Don't play it safe. Reach for what you want, even if you think it's out of reach. It very likely is not out of reach. Thank you very much for listening. Here's my contact information. I would be happy to talk with you about your career journey or any sort of professional development topic that you would like. Bye.